Hello, everybody. Welcome to Stonecutter Records Recording Studios and our new series called In the Vault, where we're honored to have some guests that I've encountered over the years that have a very, very deep treasure trove of knowledge. One of them is here with us today, Professor Tom Technoprof Miller. Tom Miller is the director of DePaul's Sound Recording Technology Program. He is a 40-year veteran of the Chicago recording industry with credits that range from the Blues Brothers to Placido Domingo. I worked with him too. His interest in recording and sound transformation found a compatible technology in 1985 with the development of the NED, New England Digital, Synclavier, and he began programming sound design for albums and commercials. An avid creator and collector of sounds, Miller created the Universal Sound Library, a timbre library for the Synclavier that was marketed worldwide. His fascination with timbral evolution, surround sound, and multimedia has led him to compose electroacoustic works for electronics, percussion, processed voices, and projected images. Miller is a graduate of the University of Iowa and DePaul University with degrees in composition. He is truly a wealth of knowledge about record engineering and the Chicago recording history. It is my great pleasure to welcome Tom Miller to Stonecutter Records in the Vault series. Hi, Tom. Thanks for coming, man.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, it's good to see you. This is going to be fun. What was your childhood like? What were some of your influences and musical talents? So we'll get you rolling.
So I started in a rock band like everybody else. We played Eric Clapton and Allman Brothers. I was a bass player, and I also played trumpet. So they liked that because we do Chicago tunes, and so I could put some horns on them. That's the way I started. I was originally intended to be a doctor. I was going to be a doctor. I took advanced placement chemistry and physics and calculus. And about my senior year of high school, I decided, I really want to make records.
Yeah, you get bit by the bug.
Yeah, and in those days, there were no recording schools. So I went to Iowa and studied. Lowell Cross was there, and he was kind of the recording guy. And I got a degree in composition, but I got to study with him, and I got to record recitals and stuff like that. And then when I graduated, I went to all the studios in town, and there were only about 5 of them in those days. There was CRC, Universal, Paragon with the Flickinger console. Gary Elkamer had a place on Michigan called 8-Track. So there weren't a lot of opportunities there, Streeterville. And so I went around to all the studios and just said, hire me, hire me, hire me. And Murray finally got sick of me coming around, and he gave me a shot. So.
That's Murray Allen.
Yes, Murray Allen.
He's like the founder of Universal?
No, he was not the founder. Murray bought Universal in the 70s.
Right.
He was actually a gigging musician. He was playing with Maynard at the time. And he bought it. It was roughly, he started buying it around 1970 and it took complete control in 1975.
Oh, cool. Yeah, we're going to circle back to the Universal history for sure because, you're very fortunate to have worked at such a great place. Tell me about your first real band. You said you played trumpet and stuff like that. What was your band like?
Oh, it was just a high school rock band, but it was like we got these gigs on Friday night and I could go out and I could play and, nobody asked where I was and you met girls and stuff. So it was your high school rock band.
One of the primary incentives for sure is
Yeah.
to meet girls. All right, cool. At Universal, who was your guru and mentor and sort of showed you how to turn a fader up?
When I started, there were 2 main engineers, Bill Bradley and Stu Walder. And Stu did a lot of the R&B records. And so I started kind of working with Bill, and ultimately I started working with Stu, and Stu loved me because I could take care of everything. He didn't have to worry about anything. He would turn around and say, patch this, it's already done.
Yeah.
So Stu kind of became my mentor, and I became his guy. And it's kind of interesting. I was technically an assistant engineer, but when Stu couldn't do a date, instead of hiring the other engineers, Leo Graham and James Mack would hire me to do it because they felt comfortable with me. I was in there every day. But yeah, I learned so much from Stu Alder. Just a wonderful human being.
Yeah, that's sort of like the food chain of how it works with the circle of life where engineers. It's like, at some point the chief engineer or the lead engineer can't make it and you got to step up.
Yep.
And you better be ready.
Oh, yeah.
Because that could be the career-changing gig.
Yep.
From what I understand, like with Queen, Roy Thomas Baker was the T-boy. And nobody wanted to work with Queen. And he's like, I'll do it. And they're like, all right, stick him in the studio with Roy. And history was
there
made.
You go.
Talk about some great records, Just talk for a second about, what your core principles are when you take in a student from the ground up and where you want to see him leave, like the importance of knowing signal flow and stuff like that.
Yeah, so the DePaul program is a really solid program. You have to take 2 years of music theory, so all my students are musicians. You have to take basic electronics, digital electronics, an op amps class, a digital audio class, and a sound and acoustics class. So they have the scientific background. You have to take calculus. And then you start taking classes with me. I teach the MIDI sequencing class called electroacoustic music, sequencing, sampling, that kind of stuff. I teach a multimedia class, basic video editing, so they learn how to put sound to picture and picture to sound. I teach the signal flow class. We have a gorgeous studio with a Neve Genesis in it. I teach the signal processing class. I teach a post-production class. We do a film score every fall. We bring in 10 brass players, 10 woodwinds, piano, bass, drums, guitar, and we do a full film score. I write about 5 minutes, and the students record it, and then they have to do all the sound design. So they get into that whole kind of sound design kind of thing. Potentially jobs in video games, that kind of stuff, working for TV, working for film. We also do, I call it recording across genres. We do a band every 2 weeks. This year we did a folk thing, we did an independent rock thing, we did kind of a heavy metal thing, and we did a theater troupe. And so they have different kinds of recording experiences. So we do a band, and then they have a week to mix it. Then we get together and everybody plays their mixes. We talk about them. They get to compare them to the person that's sitting next to them, and then we mix it as a class. So it's kind of a training thing. And then we also do a session on surround sound, 5.1, and they have to mix their capstone project in 5.1 surround. So it's a really solid program. When you get out of my program, these kids are ready to get out there and work.
Yeah, man, that's solid, and it's proven to be true with my experience with some of the students that I've seen come over here. They really do have a sound. Fundamental. What are the actual degrees that are offered there? I mean, is it audio engineering?
Our degree is a Bachelor of Science. It's a Bachelor of Science in Music with an emphasis in audio engineering.
And then I'm sure as far as the whole music department, there's peripheral programs too, like sound or music. The music department is probably sort of like mingles.
Yeah, most of DePaul is primarily a performance space. So most of the kids are performers. We have 2 orchestras, a couple of wind ensembles. So most of the students are performers. My students work in the halls doing sound reinforcement, doing recording, doing lights and stuff like that. So we're very much integrated into the school. And like I said, my students have to take theory just like a flute major.
Yeah, that's serious. So, just to give the props where props are due, who is sort of like put this, I'm sure you had most to do with putting a program together, a lot to do with it, but who's like the person that supported this whole thing in the early DePaul?
That's a great question. Yeah. Murray Allen is a DePaul grad, and he started the program.
Wow.
That's how, so not only did Murray hire me, he was the one that came up to me one day and said, "Hey, do you want to teach a class tonight?" "What do you want me to teach?" He said, "We want to do a Synclavier class." He said, "Do you want to teach a class?" So I taught the class. Kids were all excited. They said, "What are we doing next week?" I said, "I didn't know anything about next week."
Wow.
But he really wanted me to teach a course, and this was 1990. So that was the first year we graduated. So I've been teaching in this program since the absolute beginning. Every kid in this program has taken a class
32
from me.
years.
Yeah,
man. Well, bless his heart. I mean, talk about changing your life.
Right. Not only did Murray hire me, Murray started this program and introduced me to teaching. Murray gave his estate to DePaul University, and that's why if you go to DePaul, Murray's name is on the recording studio. Murray and his wife Maggie gave not Maggie, she called herself Colleen. Michelle gave the bulk of their estate to DePaul, and his name is on the recording studio.
Wow, I'm going to have to do a little more backstory on that at some point. What do you think, how do you describe the primary role of a recording engineer?
The recording engineer's job is to execute the artist's vision, If you're inserting yourself in the process, and there are times when you need to, when the artist doesn't have a vision and you need to help him kind of get his vision. But I think the engineer's real job is to figure out what the artist wants and to achieve that for him.
Yeah, for those who haven't had the chance to work in a proper recording studio, there was usually a bit of a hierarchy. There's the artist, then there's the producer, then there's the recording engineer, and then there's the assistant. So I've always
That
looked-
was the traditional model. I mean,
Right.
in the 70s and 80s, every session had a head engineer and an assistant engineer, and then typically the producer, and it could be a writer, and then the artist.
Yeah, these days, I mean, so many people wear more than one hat. But, when you were saying the engineer executes the artist's vision, it's so often true, and engineers are multi-talented people, but they're also sort of the person to guide all the technical interface for the art to the technology. They're to sort of make the technology invisible so the creative process can go uninterrupted.
Well said.
And then the producer helps with the songs. And sometimes the producer has a technical ability, they'll know stuff, but they're more often not the musician that's there to help with the songs. And then following up on that, what would you say is the role and some duties of an assistant engineer?
The assistant engineer should be invisible. When the
You hear that, guys?
producer turns around to the assistant engineer and says, "What do you think?" You do not put an opinion in. There are already 3 opinions in the room. We do not need yours.
Yeah.
My job as the assistant engineer was to make sure that the engineer had everything they needed all the time.
Yeah.
It was,
You really got to have their back. And that's how you get welcome and invited back to the room. When the engineer knows you got his back,
Right.
then he wants you there.
Right.
And you got to make him look good. There's a lot of stuff that can go wrong. And, one of the other...
lots of stuff.
Yeah, one of the other series I was doing was Bruce Breckenfeld, who was one of the chief technical engineers at CRC. And that's a wonderful series of videos. And, check it out if you haven't seen it yet. He had to counter everything from a scratchy knob to a broken pot to a microphone that was cutting in and out to, all kinds of eventually computer issues and things like that. Which makes me, since we're kind of ran into this headline, the Synclavier, and this is something that was at its inception an amazing digital sampler keyboard, one of the first. And this thing was expensive, and it was pretty complicated, operating on an old floppy disk even, But, for the modern equivalent, is a MIDI controller hooked up to a sampler, which, now you can get for $1,500 or something. But this thing was a couple $100,000. So tell us a little bit about the Synclavier and how that all came together.
So this Universal bought a Synclavier roughly 1984, and the Synclavier was really the first tapeless studio. It combined sampling, FM synthesis, and it had a built-in sequencer. And the idea was that when you called up a sequence on the Synclavier, it loaded all the patches, which was a completely new thing. I mean, up until that point, if you had MIDI stuff, you'd have to go to each box and load up the patches and stuff, and they wouldn't be stored. Synclavier would call all that up. And so we began doing these, in essence, mock orchestras. And a lot of it was for demo stuff. And then I got into creating sounds. Basically started out recording drum sounds and creating drum samples because the samples they had were not particularly realistic. And so in 1985, Synclavier flew me out to Dartmouth. They had an annual convention of all the Synclavier drivers. And they flew me out there, and I gave a speech about, my sample library and stuff. And everybody came up to me and said, "I have to buy this. You have to sell this."
Yeah.
And so I talked to Synclavier, and we set up a marketing deal, and it was called the Universal Sound Library. And we sold them worldwide. It sold probably 40 or 50 of them. They were $6,000, of which I got about $500. But
something.
Something. And we sold them. Sold some in Japan. A bunch
You still
of them
have
in
all those samples?
Oh yeah.
I'd like to get my hands on those. It's actually, it was 16-bit, right, though?
They were 16-bit, but the Synclavier could record all the way up to 100K sample rate.
Wow.
And they did a whole bunch of tests at the time, and they figured out that the optimum signal to noise was sampling at 50.5 kilohertz. So for years, we sampled at 50.5 kilohertz. It was just kind of a thing.
Well, I'd never heard that.
Yeah.
That's incredible. So, like a lot of these specialist technologies, it was a great gig to have because very few people knew how to use it. And there was always the Synclavier operator.
Right.
And it sort of came with the session if you wanted a Synclavier. So you'd have to pay for the rental Synclavier. Then you got to pay the operator, who was generally not the engineer.
Right.
Because the engineer's got enough to do already besides learning this crazy new box. And,
which was why I was so powerful, because I ran the console, I ran the Synclavier, I ran,
Yeah.
the whole show.
No, yeah, you have a real powerful position, that's for sure. That's how you can, again, make yourself useful to everything, and then you're always invited.
Yep.
And that's how you get on the good gigs. But what I was getting at is like, and then eventually, sure, it was a sampler and a keyboard and all this, but then, the next generation was sort of Pro Tools and Sound Designer and stuff like that, which wasn't so much the keyboard sampler thing as a digital recording device. But similarly, you had to have an operator. So there was always a Pro Tools operator, and so you'd rent the Pro Tools system, and then you have to pay the operator. And that was a gravy gig for a long time too,
Yep.
until eventually everybody learned how to use Pro Tools. I mean, for a long time, I owned like 4 Pro Tools systems and used to rent them out for a lot of money a day, and that that was great while it lasted for about 2 years, and then everybody bought their own systems.
Right.
Synclavier, not so much. I mean, they were really expensive.
That was $300,000 in 1984 money.
Right.
So you can imagine what that is today.
Yeah. I mean, and the irony is with Moore's law and all that is that the equivalent technologies you can get for under $1,000 now, which is just insane. I was lucky enough to be working with Roger Nichols, who was the engineer who did all the Steely Dan records, and he was a real proponent of early digital, and he came up with this thing called the Wendell, which was one of the first chip-based digital samples where you'd have a snare sound on a chip that was like half a second long, and back then when early digital first came out, like, I don't know, it was like 500 megabytes was like 40 grand. It was ridiculous for like a second of sampling.
In 1992, I started moving into Pro Tools, and it wasn't even Pro Tools yet. It was still Sound Tools. And I bought an interface, and I had a computer, and I needed my computer to be more powerful, and I bought 16 megabytes of RAM. 16 megabytes of RAM. $1,400.
Right.
And I bought a 1 gig hard drive. I remember the advertisement. All the storage you will ever need.
Yeah, well, they
And it
flew
was
to the moon on less.
$1,200.
They did fly to the moon on less than that. Those old tape things.
Yep.
And then the hard drive had these like 32-pin gold connector cables that the cables alone were like $200.
Right. It was, these were SCSI back in those days. Yeah.
And then you had to get the card and the cable and the interface to the drive, which I saved a lot of that stuff because you think of all the evolution of all these different interfaces and drives and connectors from SCSI all the way to Thunderbolt 3 now. There's like so many records done on these drives that you probably can't even open the file because you can't get the right connector for the drive. It's like, archiving that stuff with digital has been kind of a slippery area.
Oh, yes.
I'm sure there's been a lot of stuff lost.
I do a whole class on dead formats, and we talk about magneto-optical and jazz drives and, stuff that is just gone,
You mentioned that you were in surround sound. I was fortunate enough to do what was, I was sort of told was one of the first DVD singles ever. I did it with Mickey Hart from the Grateful Dead with Planet Drum. It was called Superlingua. And, he was just wild enough when we were doing the surround mix to like make it go bing, 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 bing. It wasn't just like some reverb in the back. It was a really, really athletic mix. That's from, mono to stereo to surround. And then these days, Dolby Atmos. That's a lot of ground to cover and a lot of speakers. In terms of like historically and sort of your experience and enjoyment from mono to like Dolby Atmos, tell us a little bit about how you feel about that.
I think surround has a place. I think I love mixing in surround. I'll be really honest. We have a 5.1 Genelec system in our studio. And I really enjoy mixing in surround, particularly for electronica kind of stuff. I think it gives so many places to put things. I also do a lot of surround kind of recordings. I was at the AES convention a number of years ago, and a guy named Morton Lynn has a company that does surround. And he talked about he would put the Decca-tree in the center and put the ensemble around it. So I write silent film scores. So about 8 years ago, I started doing that kind of thing. And every year we do some kind of a silent film score. And we experiment with 5.1 surround, putting the ensemble around the 5 mics. It's a Decca-tree with surrounds. And so I really enjoy it. I think there's a place for it.
Yeah.
I have not done anything with Atmos yet. I wrote a grant proposal to try to get some money to put it in the studio, but it has not been approved yet.
Yeah, I'm looking at that too. In my experience with music, you have your old records that were in mono and then stereo. And then if you're going to take an old record and try and transform that or fold that out to surround, that's got limited appeal, and it's kind of a novelty in a way. But when you do something like you're recording with doing surround in mind, that's a whole nother animal because you can set the mics up in a certain way and things like that. 5.1 and up are almost essential for film, though, in a theater. I mean,
yes.
That's where it really is super important. I mean, because I worked on a movie recently, and before the amateurs I was working with realized that anything had to be beyond stereo, we went and did a showing of the stereo version of the movie, and man, was it boring. I was like, man, this is not going to work. I got to remix this whole movie in surround, and I did, and what a difference. I mean, getting the subwoofer to kick, to get stuff to move with all the effects, it's pretty incredible. I think with Dolby Atmos, they're remixing a lot of catalog like they did with 5.1, and from what I understand, most people, it's, somewhat predictable that, like, some records it works for, and other records it's definitely not better. I think anything modern probably translates pretty well to that because there's usually a lot of tracks and things like that. But you get an old R&B record or something like that and Dolby Atmos, you're going to be like, what the,
Yeah,
it's pointless.
You're putting a square peg in a round hole.
Yeah.
It really, it was not recorded with that in mind. It's like the early stereo records. They were recorded in mono, and so you end up with the bass over here and the drums over here. It's just, if you're going to really do 5.1 surround, you need to record it in 5.1 surround.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a lot of fun doing that. After the Planet Drum thing, I actually got to remix Apocalypse Now because Grateful Dead did the soundtrack for Apocalypse Now, so I did the whole soundtrack to Apocalypse Now. And so
yeah?
Oh, man, was it trippy. And I'm sure they were in quite the state of mind when they made that one. Yeah, it's pretty cool. So what do you think is one of the most important tools for a recording engineer?
Bill Bradley, when I first started out, he was talking about the job of the engineer, and he said, pushing the buttons is about 25% of it. He said 75% of it is making the guy that's sitting next to you believe that you really want to achieve his vision. So the most important tool is to get along. I had a really good friend who was a great engineer, but he was kind of a jerk. And he was, he didn't know when to,
I guess we won't name any names.
No, but
you know who you are.
He was acerbic, for lack of a better word. He was little, and he would be brutally honest sometimes when it was not probably appropriate to be brutally honest. And he ended up going into the technical side of it where he didn't have to do client relations.
Right. Yeah, probably for the better. Kind of the answer that is sort of like the, philosophical answer is like the important tool for an engineer is your ears. Listening, the ability to pay attention. And that kind of goes with getting along and making the guy next to you have confidence in you is because you're actually paying attention.
Right.
And then you learn how to listen. Because I remember the first time I came into a session, first of all, seeing a board was like overwhelming. I'm like, I'll never know how to work all those buttons, not realizing they all were copies of the same thing. And then they'd be talking about something going on in the song, like, okay, yeah, they're rushing or dragging. And I was like, man, what are they hearing? I can't hear this stuff. And then, over time, by focusing and listening, I developed the ability to concentrate and, listen. It's not, you can, people have different degrees of like hearing, quality and perception, but learning how to pay attention, I was trained by some real heavyweights in LA, and it's, you're supposed to have, 3 ears, 1 ear on the producer, 1 ear on the artist, and your third ear on, on the engineer, which is your eyes, keeping an eye on everything. So you really had to like be watching everything and be listening to everything and really being able to help the session achieve its goal. Yeah, it's really cool.
It helps if an engineer is a musician, because there are some things that are difficult to teach. Is the band balanced? That's hard to teach unless you know what you're listening to.
It's something in tune.
Yes. Are they in tune? Are they playing in time? Those are things that are hard to teach people that have never played music. And that's how I think one of the real strengths of our program is that my kids have to be musicians.
Yeah, but in all fairness, some people have that like sort of talent and don't know it and aren't musicians. They might have a musical inclination and never realized it. So you don't have to be a musician.
No, you don't. You don't
and there's a
have
lot
to.
of great engineers that aren't. And there's a lot of producers that are engineers, and there's a lot of producers that aren't engineers. Okay, so back into the technology a little bit, from analog to digital and, from pre-computer to post-Pro Tools, what's your, like, pros and cons of analog audio? And then we'll sort of, be fair about, because everything's digital now, it's a digital world, similar comment on digital.
There's a quality to analog recording. I don't make any bones about it. Very few of my students will ever work in a studio that's analog anymore. There just are so few of them. I have been blessed enough that when I started, it was all analog. We had 24-track analog. 2 years later, we put in the first BTX synchronizer, and we went to 48-track analog. Murray was always wanted to be cutting edge. 1980, he bought the first 3M 32-track digital machine in Chicago. Massive machine. It was the Steely Dan machine.
Oh, yeah.
2 years later, we went to the Mitsubishi Atari 32-track system. We had two of them. Mitsubishi and Atari, they were basically the exact same machine. You could play tapes on one from the other. One was white and one was black. The Atari was
right.
white.
We had a 3M digital 32-track at Warner Brothers. I started at Warner Brothers Studios. I think that's the one that Steely Dan was.
Right,
the 3M.
But that got replaced by the Atari system, which was...
And the Mitsubishi.
Yeah.
Those things
and
were tanks.
Yeah. And then we kept running analog through the 80s. And then by about the end of the 80s, we were pretty much started going into the whole... New England Digital had a digital system called the Post Pro. Started out being a 4-track and ended up being a 16-track. And then by the time I went to Streeterville, they were using something made by Siemens called the Audiophile.
Right.
Those little stupid things that looked like R2-D2.
The AMS audiophile. Those
Yeah.
sucked. I hated that.
That was a godforsaken machine.
It was like a little green screen. It
Yep.
looked like Pong, and it's like, that was
Yep.
awful to work on. Very unintuitive and uncreative, but powerful. You were able to, keep a sample library and, call up stuff. It was big for commercials. Yeah, I mean, during that transition, I was lucky enough to come up through tape, and the transition to digital, and early digital really sucked because there was a lot of problems with it, but the idea of it, we would track the drums on analog and then put those tapes away for a while, transfer it to digital, work on the rest of the vocals and everything else on digital, and then when it came time to mix, we'd lock up the two machines and have the fresh analog drums and guitars, and then everything else with 32-track digital, so we have like 56 tracks or more if you added another 24-track. So the combination of best of both worlds was really great and very expensive, and then, sort of the evolution of that, going into the computerized workstation, there's the digital audio part of it, but then there's sort of like the word processor part of it, which that part of it's turned out to be pretty awesome because the instant recall, the ability to cut and paste, for better or worse, you can, do anything. Not that you should do anything, but you can now. So, in terms of like its effect on music in the process in the studio, how do you think things change between, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, just, kind of an overview thing?
The move into Pro Tools democratized the recording industry. Back in my day, in the 80s, it took $1 million to put a studio in. That was just the benchmark. You'd had to buy a large format console. Consoles were $400,000 or something. But with the build out and everything, it was about $1 million. Pro Tools democratized that. Now you could make a record in your basement. So a lot of music came out that would never have come out before. We did a record for Columbia, $125,000 record, and they decided that it was going to cost more to put it out, and they shelved it. a record cost $125,000 and they shelved it. So, a lot of music came out after Pro Tools did that would have never have come out. Some of it not very good. I mean,
Right.
let's be honest. And everything that comes out of people's basement is not always good. And sometimes it's good tunes and it sounds horrible. But it did make the industry available to a lot more people. By the end of the 1990s, you could put a studio in for $5,000.
Yeah, that's such a positive answer to that question, because I think a lot of people be like, "Oh, Pro Tools ruined it because people are always making things too perfect and, took all the soul out of
Pro
music."
Tools doesn't make things perfect.
No, that's for sure.
It does give you options in terms of auto-tuning vocals that are out of tune, taking drums and putting them on the grid, all that kind of stuff. You can make people sound much better than they really are.
Yeah. One of the things that, like you were saying, democratized music, well, these days with the internet and everything that's happened, people don't talk about it a lot, but there's more music than ever. There's so much. It's almost too much. And, that has pros and cons. The thing about, there's a big downside to streaming because artists don't get paid that well. But overall, more artists have a chance to make a living. And so that's sort of a net positive in that respect. Like you're saying, it opened the doors to a lot of things.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I agree that more artists can make a living. I think the business model
a small living. I mean,
yes, the business model of streaming
not a good living.
Is very.
You're right
flawed.
about that. It's definitely not a good living, but more artists can make some degree of money.
They can at least get product out there.
Right, and maybe get discovered or something like that.